So, one of the overarching trends in the whole history of video game development is that more and more games are ported to multiple platforms. In the very early days, the Atari days, ports were fairly common, especially for the biggest titles like Pac-Man, but that mainly had to do with the fractured hardware market. There just weren't dominant consoles at the time, with the partial exception of the Atari, so popular games got ported to dozens of home and arcade platforms because that was the only way to reach a sizable audience. The dominance of the NES changed this, and if you look at the NES catalog, the large majority of those titles were only available on the Nintendo. The situation improved a good bit with the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, where about, don't quote me on this figure, but about 30% of their catalogs were on both systems. Compare that rough figure to today, where about 80 or 85% of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 catalogs are on both systems. Now, the figure for the previous generation, the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox, is about the same, so the trend seems to have slowed in recent years. But what has changed in this generation is that a much higher percentage of console games get ported to the PC. Not only are there more PC ports in general, but the quality of the ports has gone up significantly, and they're more often released on the same day or only a few weeks or months after the consoles. We still often get PC ports with nagging deficiencies, like say a lack of a VSync option, and a lot of these games don't get the proper mouse-keyboard interface tweaks that they should. I'm looking at you, Skyrim. But the situation is clearly better than in the last generation, where a lot of developers went to the console and just ignored the PC entirely. On the other hand, though, the number of major PC exclusives has greatly diminished from the earlier decade, with a few major exceptions like, of course, Blizzard's games. PC gamers also still miss out on the first-party console-exclusive flagship titles, like Halo on Xbox or Uncharted or God of War on PlayStation. However, while the number of such first-party titles is about the same as in previous generations, the quality and number of third-party AAA titles has gone up significantly. For every exclusive like Gears of War, there are several BioShocks, Dead Spaces, and Assassin's Creeds available for all three platforms. So now the question is, what explains this long-term trend towards cross-platform development? Why is it becoming the norm? Well, the reasons are both technical and business-related. Starting on the tech side, consider the three obstacles to code portability. First, there's hardware-specific code, meaning mainly code specific to a particular CPU instruction set. This is actually a problem which has pretty much been totally solved, whereas in the early decades of video games, CPU-specific assembly code was the norm. For the better part of the last 2 decades, everything has been coded in higher-level languages, most commonly C and today C++. The second obstacle to portability is API and library support. Different platforms have different base-level APIs, and your code base might also depend upon libraries which don't work on all platforms, because those libraries themselves might rely upon a particular system API. As I'll discuss later, this is an as-of-yet unsolved, but conceivably solvable problem. It's perfectly possible that there could be one standard API that works across all hardware platforms. The third obstacle to portability is just the divergence of capabilities. Not all machines can do the same things, either because of divergent performance or divergent support for various devices, peripherals like game controllers or touchscreens or cameras. Obviously, if your game is designed around touchscreen input, porting to any machine without a touchscreen would require not just recoding, but actually redesigning the game. So this is actually an area of portability that has taken a step backward in recent years, as we've seen an influx of new input devices like touchscreens, plastic guitars, voice input, motion controls, etc. In most respects, though, the advances of hardware have made portability easier. First off, it's the more powerful hardware that allowed developers to move away from assembly. In the old days, programming in assembly was a necessity to get sufficient performance because, in theory at least, a human programmer can always eke more efficiency out of a machine than a compiler can. What's happened, though, with more and more powerful hardware is that those efficiencies, especially as our code bases get larger, are harder and harder for human programmers to find, and as the hardware gets faster and faster, those small efficiencies account for less and less of the overall performance picture. For example, as John Carmack tells us, Commander Keen was programmed entirely in assembly, then Doom was mostly C with assembly for critical sections, and then Doom 3 was entirely C++ without any assembly at all. While using assembly code here and there probably could have eked out some efficiencies, they would likely have been too trivial to be worth the effort. At this point, the real bottlenecks in game code usually lie in the GPU, a problem that assembly really wouldn't help with at all. Partly for this reason, it's becoming increasingly feasible to get moderately high-level graphics using even higher-level languages like Python or JavaScript. Arguably, we're not quite at that point yet, but the point is that the overhead of more convenient, more portable languages is becoming less and less significant. Another trend we've seen on the tech side is an embrace of off-the-shelf middleware and game engines, like notably the Unreal Engine. Using such an engine is almost like using a standard API, which abstracts over the differences of the various platforms. Not only do these engines spare you from writing your own renderer and so forth, they generally spare you from the most difficult portability issues. Another aspect of the tech that has fundamentally changed is that we really have, in a way, reached a certain graphics plateau, at least for whole classes of more casual games like side-scrolling platformers and puzzle games. We've reached a point of hardware sufficiency where the artists can pretty much make these games look as good as they want on most current platforms, even the less capable mobile platforms. And even where tweaking is needed, it's generally easier to do today because it's less labor-intensive to scale down high-resolution assets than scale down low-resolution assets. For example, the art assets for a PC game ported to the 360 can generally just be scaled down by software, whereas the art assets for a Super Nintendo game ported, say, to the NES would generally require artists to totally recreate an entirely separate set of lower-res sprites. On the business side of things, the obvious obstacle to making your game cross-platform is the extra development costs. As I just discussed, though, the coding work required for ports is generally diminishing. Moreover, as budgets get larger and larger, especially for AAA games, a larger and larger portion of the development costs is not in code, but rather art assets and marketing. So as the coding becomes a smaller and smaller chunk of development costs, the extra marginal costs of cross-platform development become smaller and smaller. Though, of course, this is countered somewhat by the extra support costs of a multi-platform release. But aside from development costs, the other major business factor is the extra funding a developer might get in an exclusive deal. In fact, many exclusive titles are funded from the outset by one of the console makers. For example, Trenched, aka Iron Brigade, was a Double Fine project that only got off the ground once Microsoft provided the funding on the condition that it would be a 360 exclusive. And then of course you have the first-party studios owned by the console makers, like Naughty Dog, which was acquired by Sony for the express purpose of making exclusive titles for the PlayStation. On the console maker's part, the incentive here is to get exclusive system sellers, highly desirable games that not only sell themselves but actually sell the system. So while the cross-platform trend with third-party development is very clear, what about first-party development? Well, we've seen about as many first-party titles this generation as we saw in the previous, suggesting that this business model is about as strong as it ever was. The exception, though, seems to be Microsoft, which, aside from Halo and Gears of War, has instead focused on the competitive advantage of its online service. And if you factor in Microsoft as a company's broader fixation on putting an everything box in everyone's living room, it seems quite possible to me that in the next cycle, Microsoft may make an even stronger move away from the first-party exclusive model. Microsoft desperately wants to own the living room TV before Apple grabs the market, so they'll focus on broadening the casual appeal of the next Xbox, like they've done with Kinect. First-party exclusives, especially core market exclusives, don't hinder this strategy, but they don't help it much either, which is why I think exclusives won't figure large in Microsoft's next console. This leads into a whole discussion of what the next consoles will look like, which I'll get into in another video. Now, there is one more important issue in cross-platform development, which is both a tech problem and a business problem, and that's deployment, getting your software out onto customer systems. The overall trend we've seen is easier and easier deployment. First the move from cartridges to much cheaper disks, and now from disks to digital download. And of course, the easier deployment gets, the easier it is to make a cross-platform release. As great an improvement as digital download services are, deployment could still be better, so I have a prediction to make. Given the importance of deployment, if we're going to see a standard cross-platform API for game development, and I think eventually we will, I predict that that API will most likely come in the form of the ultimate deployment solution, which is the web browser. You can already see a lot of groundwork for this coming to pass. Firefox and Chrome both already contain functional, if rough, implementations of WebGL for 3D graphics and other in-the-works APIs for sound, game controller support, and better keyboard and mouse input. Here, for example, is an HTML5 game demo running in Firefox without the use of plugins. It's fairly crude, but the potential is clear. There are, however, of course, a few obstacles. First off, while JavaScript can be surprisingly capable and perhaps perfectly adequate for less intensive games, capturing the high end would probably require support for something closer to native compiled code. So there's quite a lot of talk coming out of Google about an alternative to JavaScript, something which supports static typing, or at least the runtime efficiencies of static typing, and so affords better performance. Other sticking points include getting some kind of Steam-like DRM and anti-cheat in the browser, but I'm fairly confident that once the other pieces are in place, solutions could be worked out.